When most people hear math, they think about long calculations involving large numbers, never-ending fractions, and logarithms everywhere. But the question I'm thinking about is, how do we study the universe? This might not seem like a math problem at first glance. After all, we have telescopes that astronomers use to form pictures of our visible corner of the cosmos. But there's no telescope that can see the whole universe at once. What does space as a whole look like? Does it look like this? Or like this? Or maybe it looks something like this. At the end of the day, this is a geometry problem. Or put differently, how many holes does the universe have? And if we can't count these holes with our eyes or with a telescope, is there some other way to detect them? Using math, we can hear the shape of an object without ever seeing it. Take this donut again, for instance. The bottom and the top of the hole are special regions called saddles. At the bottom of the hole, there's a curve that swings down. There's also a curve that swings up, just like a riding saddle. The saddles are very special in geometry. They're like musical notes that can be heard amongst the noise of the rest of the shape. To help hear these notes, we need equations, and one of the best gifts that Einstein gave the world was an equation. Not E equal to mc squared, but this one. This is his famous field equation, which describes the shape of the universe. It's part of the general theory of relativity, whose predictions have been verified experimentally over the past 100 years in many different ways. The question is, can we hear those special notes, the song of the saddles, if you will, inside Einstein's equations, or within other newer equations in physics, such as those coming to us by way of string theory? Math has the power to answer these questions, and the whole universe is our lab.
So I'm Yin Liu. I'm from the Department of English. I'm also a faculty member with Classical Medieval Renaissance Studies, and I suppose you can call my research thinking with books in the Middle Ages. Information technology is a much longer history than most people realize, and my research looks at its development during a period that's usually neglected when people think about this history. So the Middle Ages, which for my purposes goes from about 500 to 1500. During this period, medieval people invented, or at least normalized, many of the design features we take for granted in the modern printed book. So this 15th century manuscript missal in the US Special Collections, for example, incorporates navigational aids, the use of color, and script within the text, as well as these sewn in leather tabs that mark the most heavily used sections of the book, so users can go straight to there. From my point of view, the most important aspect of this manuscript is the fact that it's been heavily used. It's dirty. There are parts that have fallen out or been cut out, as you can see. And it's obvious that instead of being kept in a glass case and admired from afar, it's been handled by centuries of grubby hands and somewhat mauled as a result. So it's the human use of these devices that can tell us most about how they were meant and employed to help people think. One of my students, Ariel Brecht, has been working on this 13th century manuscript fragment, Eggy number 4, in our collections. The original manuscript was a collection of model sermons, and the words in the margins are probably either indexing terms or they're cross-referenced to another type of reference work, a sermon composition aid. So this unexciting looking fragment, which until a couple of years ago, no one under the age of about 700 years old had even tried to read, is in fact quite significant as evidence of a major shift in the 13th century in the way people in Europe used books in conjunction with a trained human memory. The medieval book was meant as a support for memory. It was a tool for augmenting human intellect and extension of thought. So the medieval book wasn't just a data dump, a mere storage facility, but was designed to work with and enhance the powers of the mind. And I'm hoping that looking at medieval documents as information technology will enable us not only to ask new questions about medieval books, but also to apply more historically informed principles to information design today.
I'm a numerical analyst. A numerical analyst is someone who uses computers to solve math problems. If you have ever used a computer to calculate something mathematical, as simple as an average, or as complicated as the solution to a differential equation, you have benefited from numerical analysis. So just like computers and computation are everywhere these days, usually working innocuously behind the scenes, so is numerical analysis. This allows a researcher like me to work on a broad range of problems that might otherwise seem completely unrelated. For example, take artificial intelligence. Some of my work with the Saskatoon Police Service uses artificial intelligence to do things like assess the risk of releasing a convicted offender from prison, or the risk of a young person to go missing, or the risk of releasing someone who has been accused of a crime before their trial. Other work with the Global Institute for Water Security uses simulation methods to predict the water flows in North America to help plan future water management. On another project, we simulate the behavior of plasmas as the basis for fusion reactors and plasma thrusters that can be used in spaceflight. I work on the design of error-correcting circuits that will lead to the next generation of computer processors, otherwise known as quantum computing. I also work in the area of cardiac simulation. We are working on methods to create real-time simulations of heart function that can be used by clinicians to plan the impact of drugs or surgery on the heart before actually doing them in people. This is just a snapshot of the cool and impactful problems that can be solved with the help of numerical analysis.
If we wish to be truly innovative in developing new communication technologies, we must first understand the history of books and why readers think the way they do. We learn to read from books. To phrase it another way, books teach us how to read. And I would argue in teaching us how to read, books also teach us how to think. One of the first things books teach us in the Western culture is that books for children look like this. But the books we should aspire to read, grown-up books, look like this. This is where my research starts. Why does a book look like this? What does this particular form of the book encourage us to believe about the act of reading, the act of writing? And how are these beliefs being challenged or perpetuated as we increasingly rely upon electronic texts instead of the printed page? To answer these questions, one has to turn to history and look at the development of the book as a communications technology. When one does that, it becomes clear that our modern ideas of a book, what it is, what it could be, have been formed over at least 1,000 years of innovation, of debate, of change, perhaps most surprisingly, of the people making and reading books insisting they stay exactly the same. Given the nearly 700 years between these two texts, wouldn't you expect there to be more difference in their visual form? The humanists of the Italian Renaissance wanted a new form of the book, one that was clean and clear and allowed them to converse with the glorious dead, free from the distractions of medieval manuscripts. The first printed books looked just like manuscripts because that's what people were used to reading. From this point onward, the evolution of the visual design of books shifts slightly as technologies and politics shift. But whenever a change goes beyond the unnoticeable, it is quickly refuted by readers who desire their books to not get between them and their authors. Books, and those that make them, have taught us to think that when we read, we are looking through a window into the mind of the author, and that the highest praise for a book is it doesn't get in the way of reading. This was true in the 15th century, and it's true now. If we want to design new books that people will actually read, we first need to look to the past and see how books have taught us how to think.
Okay, my research is on, well, I have a big research project on philosophy and drugs, psychoactive drugs in particular. And right at the moment, that project is focusing on a philosopher called Immanuel Kant, who was in the 18th century. So he's in the Enlightenment. And he's a particularly important philosopher because he's still incredibly influential, not only in philosophy, but also in fields like psychology to some degree, and sociology and anthropology. So what I'm looking at is some of the things that he said actually about intoxication and the use of intoxicants, which turn out to be a little bit surprising. One thing that Kant is known for is his sort of moral philosophy, his thinking about the nature of right and wrong and what sorts of things morality demands of us. And for him, the notion of rationality is incredibly important. And in all of our choices and actions, morality, he thinks, demands of us that we show respect for our nature as rational agents. And this then raises a problem for the use of intoxicants and intoxication. Because if you're intoxicated, that has some impact on your ability to reason and make rational choices. And in fact, Kant says the various things about it that make it clear he thinks that it's very morally problematic. In fact, he describes the drunk person or the intoxicated person as lowering themselves below the level of an animal. And it's all because of his thinking that, you know, we have an absolute moral duty to preserve our capacity to intelligently use our powers. This is what he puts very much at the center of morality. So, given that, it's actually a little bit surprising then that we also see him in another place praising what he calls social intoxication. So we think if intoxication is absolutely morally disallowed, then why is social intoxication okay? So my project is looking at why he thinks that. It turns out that he thinks that getting a little bit intoxicated for the right reasons is perhaps morally good because it lowers our inhibitions and allows us to be more open-hearted and frank with other people. But I'm looking at how that tension could possibly be resolved. And also because Kant is located in the late 18th century and he's so important, it's a time when certain thinking about addiction and drug use and so on is just kind of getting going, the modern concepts we have of these things. So I'm also trying to place his thinking in relation to that and see how he's responsible for certain aspects of our current thinking. Something that's perhaps a little topical these days, given the recent legalization of cannabis, for example.
So how do artists think? Thinking for an artist might include divergent thoughts. They might be open to adversity. Their thinking might be informed by observation, reading, and day-to-day interactions with others. Their thinking may also be nonlinear by way of problem solving. How do artists represent thinking? So artists might explore possibilities of inner and outer worlds. Artists recognize that images are powerful tools and can help other people think differently about topics such as social behavior, history, the environment, politics, myth, and stories. They might change their environment. They might take a course or go on a residency. New places involve adaptation, and change might lead to discomfort, restraint, or limitations of resources. Funny enough, these unanticipated shifts happen to be healthy for artists since this leads to new problem solving. Here I'll use a personal example. After developing 2 large painting series that took 3 years to make, I was creatively exhausted in 2017 and didn't want to paint for a while, so I decided to shift my focus to a new direction and took a masterclass in 3D projects, including animation with Unity. Since then, I've presented AR and VR projects in Saskatoon with the Saskatoon Jazz Orchestra. I've presented virtual reality projects at the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto, and an augmented project at the School of Machines Making and Make-Believe in Berlin. This new medium offers me a break from painting since it is digital and AR and VR is new, There are endless possibilities to use traditional art methods with this medium. It has also presented opportunities for me to collaborate with diverse disciplines and researchers. The studio is where I work, and during the year, this is where you can find me 4 to 7 days a week. I don't always start making immediately. I warm up to the idea, and sometimes I look at books, sketch an idea, or simply daydream for the first 40 minutes. The wall behind me is often covered with preliminary sketches, ideas, mapping out of images for site-specific works, or simply to collage photos for another series that I might get to later.
I'm a linguist. That means that I'm a scientist that studies how language works. Most people, when I tell them I'm a linguist, they ask me how many languages I speak. People who speak a lot of languages are polyglots. They're not linguists. They can be, but that doesn't mean you are a linguist by nature. So what linguists do is they look into how language works in the brain, in society, in children, how they acquire it, how computers talk or don't, in humans in general, and how languages compare, how they evolve, how they disappear, how they relate to non-linguistic aspects of human lives, such as gender, time, geography, socioeconomic status, etc. At its most basic, language is a system that relates sound, form, and meaning. So among the hundreds of linguistic sounds that exist in the world languages, a child learns how to pick the sounds that are relevant to the language they have to learn, and put them together, arrange them into words, and then into sentence, and then assign meaning to all of that. So in my research, I'm looking into that relationship between sound and meaning and form in Inuktitut, a language spoken in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories. Indigenous languages are notoriously understudied, and it's therefore important to increase our knowledge about them, because many are in danger of disappearing. In fact, every 2 weeks a language disappears in the world because the last speaker passes on. So we have a responsibility to increase our knowledge and to preserve and revitalize them as best as we can.
My area of research is within theater design. In that area, I allow people to think. So for me, I'm a storyteller, and I try to get the audience to start to think and to imagine and to create a world for themselves. My job is to give them a visual, to start that imagination, to send them to places that maybe they didn't know they could go, whether it's a location, a time period, or just an emotional place that they never thought they could be. When I begin working, my process is to understand the story that I want to tell, and that begins with the director telling me the story that they wish to tell as well. The first question that I will always ask is, how do you want your audience to feel at the end of the production? And this then equals us understanding what a person is going to think while they're watching a show. In the world that we currently live in, everything is very immediate. We live in the world of cell phones and digital technology that was not there when theater began. And a lot of people look for an immediate answer. And my job as a researcher in design is to make people slow down a little bit and think about humanity and how we treat each other and how we can go forward to become a better community, to become better human beings. One of the shows that meant a lot to me in my research area was a show called Displaced. This was a story of 3 immigrant women from 3 different time periods who landed in Canada, and the treatment and process that happened for them when they arrived. And I started my research with this show because I seen it in its early revisions, and I called the director and said, you need to have me work with you on this show, and the next time you do it, I need to be a part of it. And we continued to work that show multiple times after that phone call. And the last time that it was performed, we actually took it to a fringe festival in Singapore, and it was well received. They loved that a story like that came from Canada, and it meant a lot because it stopped people to understand that what happened in 1847 was still happening in 2018, and we need to make some progress. And so it was definitely a show that made people stop and think.
The question that I'd like to address today is not how does music work, but why? Why do we do music? Why do we have a music department? What's a music department supposed to do? And in my opinion, first and foremost, a music department is supposed to build the cultural capital of our community. How do we go about this? A primary function of our department is to train musicians. We train people to go out to be music educators, to be performers, to be composers, to pursue careers in the academic stream of music. Music is special in that it teaches people, it integrates the mind, body, and spirit in special ways. People learn to be creative in our department. They learn to solve problems on their own. They learn to work in groups. They learn to express themselves and to have vision. They're often quite altruistic people. And then they go from our department and go into the world and do incredible things. So it's a pleasure and an honor to work with undergraduate and graduate students in the Department of Music. And that's one critical aspect of what we're here, why we're here, and what we do. The second critical aspect is that examples make the best teachers. For a performance-oriented faculty person such as myself, me doing my own professional projects in the community and in Canada means that when I come back, I have helped build the cultural capital of our community, and I'm a more informed teacher as well. The cultural capital of our community does a number of things. One needs to remember that culture is the way in which people know us. It is the way we express ourselves. It's the way a community sorts through its problems. And artists are in many ways social commentators on the state of a culture. So having a vibrant arts community is a way in which a culture can communicate with itself and express itself and better itself. And again, it's the way people will get to know us. No one remembers who the world's greatest accountant was in Salzburg during Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's time. But they remember who Mozart is, and it was important to have accountants during that time. But the fine arts are the residual evidence of what a culture is all about what it did and thought and valued. The other aspect of cultural capital is monetary. Cultures with strong fine arts tend to do well economically. People don't go to London or New York to enjoy the weather. They go there for commerce and for culture. That's just but two examples. So having a strong and vibrant music department at the University of Saskatchewan equips our community to move forward in ways that we can continue to understand each other, to express ourselves, and to build a more civil and humane society for all.
I'm a historian of health and medicine, and I became interested in this topic when I was looking at the history of Saskatchewan and how Saskatchewan, this in some respects, this hard to reach place, became home to a series of healthcare reforms. But the more I studied those healthcare reforms, the more I became interested in medical research. And what I ultimately became very interested in was the creation of psychedelic psychiatry and the way that LSD experiments were internationally significant here in the province of Saskatchewan, and how they were connected to major health reforms in the province in the mid-20th century. So the word psychedelic was coined here in Saskatchewan, and it was designed by psychiatrists who were going to great lengths to try to understand what their patients were experiencing. So doctors, psychiatrists, psychiatric nurses took LSD and mescaline in order to give themselves what they thought was a psychotic experience so that they could empathize with their patients. And from that, they developed a whole series of hospital reforms, staffing reforms, insights into major psychiatric illnesses like schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. And it really started to augment some of the mental health care reforms that were taking place here in Saskatchewan in the mid-20th century. So psychedelic psychiatry is now, and psychedelic science is now reaching a renaissance according to contemporary neuroscientists and psychopharmacologists. And so this historical research has become very interesting and valuable as we try to understand again how psychedelics might shape our understandings of health and wellness, but also how some alternative practitioners, in particular Indigenous healers, have used different kinds of spiritual quests, such as the ones that are explored in psychedelics, how some of that research and how some of those rituals might be reincorporated into our mental health arena.
Do insects think? Or, more specifically, are insects conscious? Watching a fly buzzing around a room or grasshoppers hitting your windshield, you might come to the conclusion, well, maybe not. But insects can do some complex things. For example, flight control is very difficult, yet insects do it very well. Just observe a dragonfly hovering and even flying backwards. Even if we had wings, our visual system is probably too slow for the control required to prevent us from crashing. So insects are better than us at some things. Now, like us, insects also have a brain. And that brain collects and analyzes information and perceives aspects of the environment, allowing them to make decisions related to survival, just as we do. But while it is a relatively small brain, it successfully controls complex things. Within the insect brain are analogous structures that are comparable to those found in other animals, including us. For example, our midbrain is thought to be responsible for the basic capacity of subjective experience. Recent techniques that map the insect brain suggest that there are regions that perform similar functions of our midbrain. Insects also have brain regions called mushroom bodies that seem to have similar function to our hippocampus, which is involved in learning and memory. But brain regions alone cannot answer the question of insect consciousness. We must turn to physiological and behavioral data. Studies have shown that bees can recognize individual human faces and distinguish abstractions between paintings by Monet or Picasso. And remarkably, bees can also use tools to carry out a task. So, by asking the right questions, we can begin to uncover whether insects exhibit complex neural processing that we may associate with consciousness. The benefit of studying complex neural processing in insects is that while their behaviors can be complex, their nervous systems are tractable. That is, we know from individual to individual what certain neurons are, and so we can gather data on activity of single cells and the role they play in these complex behaviors. And to take this further, techniques that allow us to record from many neurons at once can then help us expand our understanding of how groups of neurons process complex information and how decisions are made. A practical aspect of studying complex neural processing in insects is robotics. If we can understand how this biological system can make decisions on the order of thousandths of a second, we can incorporate these computations into artificial systems to provide faster and more robust tasks. So to come back to the original question, do insects think? Well, I think they might, and this is part of what we study in my lab in the Department of Biology.
I've been undertaking ethnographic research with a group of Quechua Maya medical practitioners and their patients in southern Belize for more than 15 years. The scope of the research is broad, but the focus is on uncovering the overall structure of their medical system. This is particularly challenging as there are no written texts documenting their knowledge, and each practitioner has learned their trade working with different masters. The Quechua have a clear conception of the mind as separate from the body, and therefore they recognize a variety of disorders that affect the mind alone. This includes disorders understood to affect thinking. One of these is Jawal Nakushlak, or in an English gloss, thinking too much. The root of this term is kalushlak, which literally means to think, but is used by the practitioners in the therapeutic context to mean excessive worry or anguish. Together, these two disorders are fundamentally about unachievable wants and desires and the inability to resolve personal, interpersonal, and material dilemmas. The signs and symptoms of both involve excessive consternation and distraction. A sufferer exhibits an inability to concentrate and acts in an anxious manner. Their anguish may also evolve into a depression-like state where the patient withdraws from everyday social responsibilities. Jawal Nakushlak is considered to be the most severe of the two conditions and can be fatal. Memory loss is a possible consequence of both if left untreated. Diagnosis of these problems, like many disorders that Quechua medical practitioners treat, starts with pulsing or shibal ishkikel. The feel of the blood passing through the arteries at various points on the body provides diagnostic clues as the practitioners speak to the sickness and engage in consultations with the medical specialists of the spiritual world. Treatment involves medicinal plants, which the patient consumes and in which they bathe. Both disorders are curable, and any recurrence is understood as a new sickness. Thinking too much is but one of a host of disorders recognized in the Quechua medical system. As my research moves forward, I'll continue to document and conceptualize these disorders within the broader framework of an indigenous medical system that remains essential in the provisioning of medical services to the Quechua people.
People spend a lot of their time coordinating their actions together with other people. Examples range from handing money to a cashier and receiving a cup of coffee in return, to playing together on a sports team or singing in a choir. When we do these kinds of activities, each person involved has to plan their actions and adjust them on the fly in light of what they expect other people to do and in light of the shared goals that they're trying to achieve. My research investigates the mental processes and brain activity that allow us to do these kinds of activities together. The two main techniques we use in the lab are recording the timing of people's actions and recording their brain activity using EEG. With EEG, we can measure the electrical activity of the brain through small metal discs placed on people's scalps. We're currently using recently developed EEG hyperscanning techniques, which means that we record brain activity from 2 or more people at the same time. We ask our participants to do things like coordinate sequences of taps together with each other, or make music together using electronic music boxes. These are devices that let people with no musical experience make music together just by spinning simple rotating discs. We also sometimes work with professional musicians outside the lab. In our most recent project, we recorded brain activity from 4 violinists during a performance of the Saskatoon Symphony Orchestra. Our research looks at brain activity both within people and synchronized across people. Looking at brain activity within people, we answer questions like, how do people form mental representations of the shared goals they're trying to achieve? Or how does my brain respond to mistakes that I make compared to mistakes that my partner makes? Looking at brain activity synchronized across people is very new. We're just starting to understand the extent to which this synchrony happens, and the psychological processes that contribute to it. A question that we're currently working on is whether synchrony across brains underlies a feeling of acting together as one that can sometimes happen when people play music together, for example, in large groups. Our research helps us understand things like how people can optimize their coordination to work together more smoothly and with fewer errors, and can also potentially answer questions like, why does playing music together with other people lead to mental health benefits?
Our lab focuses on mapping thinking onto the dorsal and ventral processing streams of the brain. The dorsal stream is very analytical and controlled, and it specializes in representing where something is in our environment and how we interact with it, whereas the ventral stream is very holistic and automatic and specializes in identifying what the object is. When we ask fMRI participants to either say what a target picture or word is, where it is located on the screen, or how they would interact with it, we see this distinction quite clearly. On the right panel, unique picture activation is in yellow, word activation is in blue, and on the left panel, the shared activation is shown in green. We're also very interested in reading processes and how the dorsal stream represents analytical phonetic decoding, whereas the ventral stream represents holistic or lexical reading. We see this distinction when we ask fMRI participants to either phonetically decode pseudohomophones, which are non-words that sound like words, and they're shown on the right in blue, or holistically read exception words, and these are words that can't be phonetically decoded, shown in yellow. Controlled attention involves more of the dorsal stream, whereas reflexive or automatic attention involves more of the ventral stream. We recently showed this distinction when examining the sharing of ventral stream regions of reflexive attention with lexical reading of exception words, on the left side in red, and of dorsal stream regions of controlled attentional processing with pseudohomophone phonetic decoding on the right side in yellow. Our lab also applies this basic research to help neurosurgeons localize function and structure in patients about to undergo surgery for either dorsal stream impairments, in this case using diffusion tensor imaging and basic motor fMRI for a dorsal astrocytoma, or in this case ventral stream impairments in temporal lobe epilepsy using fMRI of lexical reading of exception words. We also combine analyses of behavior and brain to guide the development of computational models of cognitive processing. Here we show how manipulating instructions for reading can affect behavioral reaction time and brain activation, which informs our models in terms of when various stages of processing occur and where they are located. Finally, I'd like to thank NSERC for continuous support of this research and my students.